Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffundafer had been watching this case from the very beginning. Coffundafer called this case red hot. She said it on Newsweek. She said it on television. And, according to sources familiar with the evidence who spoke to Brian Anton, analysts at Arizona State University were having difficulty separating the individual profiles from the mixture. Mixed DNA samples are not uncommon at a residential scene, but they require significantly more processing time, and a result that might take weeks in a standard case can take months when the mixture is complex. As of the production of this video, no public confirmation of a final DNA analysis had been released. The footage gaps told a different story. FBI agents collected camera footage from multiple points around the property, including cameras positioned on the sides of the house, near the back, and near the pool area. But investigators noted something in what the footage did and did not capture. One source, speaking to Brian Anton, described the gaps in the recovered footage with a specific phrase. "What's missing is odd." That phrasing is careful and deliberate, the kind of thing someone says when they believe the absence of information is itself a form of information. And the sheriff's office said nothing to contradict her, nothing to clarify, nothing at all. So what does she know? On day 45 of the investigation, the FBI came back to the neighborhood. They were asking about the construction site. A house nearby had been under active renovation, meaning there had been workers, contractors, and subcontractors moving through the neighborhood in the weeks surrounding Nancy's disappearance. According to a neighbor who received the inquiry directly, FBI agents asked for the complete list of names. Every contractor, every worker, everyone who had legitimate access to that street during that period. On the same day, according to sources speaking to Brian Anton, investigators were also asking questions about someone who had moved out of the neighborhood before Nancy disappeared. No name has been made public. No connection to the case has been officially established. But the FBI was asking. Annie Guthrie's car had been in law enforcement custody for 46 days before it was returned. The specific reason for that hold has never been disclosed officially. One source described the retention as reasonable without elaborating. What does red hot mean when a woman has been missing for over a month and the official investigation has gone almost completely dark? 46 days is a significant period for forensic processing. What that processing was targeting and what it found remains part of the sealed record of an active federal investigation. The picture that emerges from all of this is not of an investigation that stalled. It is of an investigation that is methodical, that is moving through a very specific checklist, and that is doing so almost entirely out of public view, which might be normal, or it might reflect something else entirely about the state of the case in Pima County. There is a specific kind of frustration that builds when you are watching two official versions of the same reality contradict each other in public, and no one in authority will say which one is true. Sheriff Chris Nanos stood before reporters in early March and said the investigation had, in his words, certainly progressed beyond where it was, and that there had been a significant accumulation of intelligence. That is the question at the center of everything that follows. That is a confident statement. That is the language of an agency that knows where it is going. But around the same time, sources speaking to journalist Megan Kelly were describing the situation in Tucson in very different terms. According to those sources, as of day 45, investigators had no suspect and nothing solid enough to support a search warrant. No suspect, no search warrant. After 45 days, those two accounts cannot both be accurate. Either the investigation had accumulated significant intelligence and was moving toward a target, or it had nothing concrete enough to bring before a judge. The gap between those two positions is not a minor discrepancy in emphasis. It is a fundamental disagreement about the state of the case, and it has never been resolved publicly. What makes that gap harder to ignore is the context surrounding the man who made the optimistic version of events his official position. Chris Nanos is not simply the sheriff overseeing a high-profile missing persons investigation. He is a sheriff facing a formal recall effort. Because to understand why those 5 words carry the weight they do, you have to go back to the night this started. According to records from his time at the El Paso Police Department, between 1,976 and 1,982, Nanos accumulated 26 internal complaints and was suspended for a total of 37 days during that period. He has been accused of misrepresenting his work history on his resume. There is a civil lawsuit against him, currently valued at $1.3 million. And Bob Kreider, a former SWAT commander at Pima County, who served under Nanos, went on the record to say that 98% of the department's personnel had voted no confidence in their sheriff. 98%. That is not a difficult internal relationship. That is an institution in open rejection of its leadership. And that institution is the one responsible for coordinating the official public response to the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman whose family includes one of the most recognized television journalists in the country. You have to understand who Nancy Guthrie is, what was waiting for her at home. There is also the matter of a second image. According to Fox Digital reporter Michael Ruiz, citing 2 law enforcement sources, a second photograph exists showing a figure near Nancy Guthrie's property. Unlike the first image, this figure carries no gun and no backpack. Ruiz and his sources identified this image as having been captured on January 11th, days before Nancy disappeared, suggesting the property may have been surveilled in advance. Nanos disputed this publicly. He said the second image was not from a different date. Multiple media organizations and sources with law enforcement access maintained that it was. That dispute has never been officially resolved. The image, if it exists as described, would change the meaning of the entire sequence of events preceding January 31st. It would mean someone was watching that house weeks before Nancy Guthrie walked through her garage door for the last time. What that means for the investigation and who ordered that surveillance is a question the official record does not yet answer, and what the evidence says happened in the hours after she walked through her front door for the last time. But it sits there, unresolved, pressing against everything else. If the agency conducting this investigation is internally fractured, led by a sheriff facing both a recall campaign and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and if its official account of the evidence conflicts with accounts given by law enforcement sources to multiple journalists, then the question of who is actually running this case becomes urgent. The FBI was visibly active in the neighborhood on day 45. Federal agents, not county deputies, were the ones requesting contractor lists and asking about a former neighbor. There is a version of this investigation in which the meaningful work is happening at a level above the sheriff's office entirely, and the press conferences are simply noise. If you have followed a case like this before and watched the pattern, you know what it looks like when a local agency is being quietly sidelined by federal investigators who have decided not to share their progress publicly. Stay with this, because the timeline alone will change how you see every single statement that has come out of Tucson since February 1st. It looks exactly like this, which brings you back to Jennifer Coffundafer and the 5 words that started this. The search phase is over. Coffundafer is not a commentator who speaks carelessly. She is a former FBI special agent who, by her own account, had been tracking this case from the beginning. She made this declaration at the 41-day mark, not to law enforcement, not in a deposition, but publicly, on social media and on national television. And she paired it with a second assessment. She called the case red hot. Red hot does not mean cold. Red hot does not mean stalled. Red hot means the investigation is moving towards something with enough velocity that someone who has seen federal investigations from the inside believes a resolution is approaching. Former FBI Special Agent Steve Moore, another analyst who had been following the case, made a separate and deeply unsettling observation that whoever was responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie was likely capable of doing it again. Nancy Guthrie had lived in the Catalina foothills for more than 50 years. Read those 2 assessments together. The case is red hot. The perpetrator may re-offend. That is not the language of an investigation circling a dead end. That is the language of an investigation that knows who it is looking for and has not yet found enough to make an arrest. Now go back to what the physical evidence actually showed. The camera was removed from its mount at 1:47 in the morning, not disabled remotely, physically taken down by a person who was standing at Nancy Guthrie's front door in the middle of the night. 41 minutes later, her pacemaker stopped syncing. The sequence is not ambiguous about one thing. Someone was inside that house, or had access to that house, after 1:47 and before 2:28, and that person did not want a camera recording what came next. Several former FBI agents who reviewed the publicly available details publicly questioned whether this case fits the standard definition of a kidnapping at all. 50 years in the same corner of Tucson, Arizona, long enough to watch the desert city grow up around her. Paul Salino, a veteran homicide investigator who spoke to the New York Post, said he did not believe Nancy was kidnapped, and that whatever the evidence showed, it pointed somewhere specific. Former FBI Deputy Director Chris Swecker expressed similar skepticism about the kidnapping narrative in comments to Fox News. James Gagliano, a former supervisory FBI agent who spoke to CNN, noted that the rate of kidnapping for adults over 80 is statistically near zero. He raised the possibility that the ransom notes were not evidence of an abduction, but a constructed layer designed to obscure what actually happened. If those assessments are correct, then the ransom notes sent to newsrooms, with their Bitcoin addresses and their broken deadlines, were not communications from kidnappers. They were theater, and theater requires a director. Someone who had access to information about Nancy Guthrie's routines, her home's layout, her security setup, and her schedule. Someone who understood the household well enough to know when to move and what to remove. Someone for whom this was not a random target selected from outside. She had tracked every press conference, every leak, every silence, long enough to become part of the neighborhood's fabric. Former CIA and FBI analyst Tracy Walder said it directly. This is not the kind of house you walk past and decide to rob on impulse. Every confirmed detail of the physical evidence, the camera removal, the timing, the specific preparation visible in the first photograph, supports that assessment entirely. The investigation, 41 days in, was no longer searching. It was waiting for something it did not yet have. And a former federal agent who had watched it from the beginning believed she knew what that meant. If someone in your life came to you right now and said they knew what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and they needed you to hear it, you would share this video with them without a second thought. Because this case is not finished, and the people who need to understand what the evidence is actually showing are not all in law enforcement. By day 46, the shape of the investigation had shifted in ways that were visible even from the outside. The Pima County Sheriff's Office formally confirmed on February 16th that the entire Guthrie family had been cleared. Every sibling, every spouse. She was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker. Tommaso Cioni, the son-in-law who had driven Nancy home on the night of January 31st, was no longer under scrutiny. The family had cooperated fully throughout the process. They submitted to polygraph examinations voluntarily. They turned over personal devices for forensic review. Whatever questions investigators initially had about people closest to Nancy, those questions had been answered to law enforcement's satisfaction. On day 46, Annie Guthrie's car was returned after being held as evidence for the duration. The specific forensic purpose of that hold was never disclosed publicly. Cars are held in investigations like this for a range of reasons, and the return of a vehicle does not signal the end of its evidentiary relevance, only the end of direct custody. What was also happening on day 46 was a formal political challenge to the man overseeing the county's side of the investigation. Daniel Boutier, a Republican congressional candidate in Arizona, launched a recall effort against Sheriff Nanos. According to Sheriff Nanos himself, she could not walk 50 yards on her own. Under Arizona law, the effort required 120,000 valid signatures within 120 days. Whether that effort succeeds or fails, its launch on the same day, Annie Guthrie's car was returned, created a visible symbol of how far public confidence in the official response had eroded. Inside the investigation itself, the threads that remained open were specific. The contractors and workers from the nearby construction site. The individual who had relocated from the neighborhood before Nancy disappeared, whose name has not been made public, and whose connection to the case, if any, has not been officially established. The mixed DNA samples still being processed. The camera footage gaps that an investigative source described as odd. The flashlight. The second photograph, disputed by Nanos but confirmed by multiple other sources. The 41 minutes between 1:47 and 2:28 that no official account has yet explained. She took heart medication every day, a prescription she depended on not as a matter of routine, but as a matter of staying alive. These are not loose ends in a case that has run out of direction. These are the remaining pieces of a case that is being built carefully, out of public view, towards something that has not yet arrived. The FBI does not announce what it is doing until it is ready. That is not a criticism. That is the structure of a serious federal investigation. What Jennifer Coffundafer announced was not what the FBI was hiding. It was what she could see from where she was standing, that the Bureau had moved past one phase and into another, and that the next phase was not a search. What this case teaches us about the anatomy of staged crime scenes is something investigators have studied for decades, but the Nancy Guthrie disappearance puts it in unusually clear relief. When ransom notes arrive at a television station instead of a family's front door, That is not a procedural oddity. She was also the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. That is a structural failure of the ransom narrative itself. The logic of a genuine kidnapping for money is built entirely on leverage. The victim stays alive because the victim is the mechanism of payment. Communication goes to the people with access to funds, under conditions designed to prevent law enforcement involvement. Sending notes to newsrooms accomplishes the opposite of both those goals. It invites maximum public and law enforcement attention, and it directs pressure away from the family and toward the media cycle. Experienced investigators call this kind of misdirection staging, and it has a recognizable signature. The 2 broken deadlines without follow-through are part of that signature. In a genuine ransom situation, a missed deadline triggers escalation. Something happens to demonstrate that the threat is real. When 2 deadlines pass and nothing follows, the silence itself becomes evidence that the ransom mechanism was never designed to function as a real negotiation. That detail matters, not because celebrity proximity makes a victim more deserving of attention. James Gagliano's reference to virtual kidnapping is worth understanding in more depth. Virtual kidnapping is a documented criminal pattern in which the abduction is fabricated, often using AI-generated or impersonated communications to extract money from a panicked family before they can verify that anything has actually happened to their loved one. In those cases, the victim is typically alive and unaware. But virtual kidnapping can also be layered onto a real crime as cover, a way to send investigators in one direction while the actual evidence points somewhere else. What this case also illustrates is how the credibility of an investigation depends on the credibility of the institution conducting it. When a sheriff's department is facing a recall effort, a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit, and a documented no-confidence vote from its own personnel, its public statements cannot be evaluated in isolation. The gap between what Nanos said in early March and what law enforcement sources told, but because it tells you something about the family's capacity to put pressure on a story, and about how visible this case became almost immediately. Megyn Kelly, that same week, is not just a factual dispute, it is a trust problem. And trust problems in high-profile investigations have a documented history of slowing down the path to accountability, not because investigators are incompetent, but because the public information environment becomes too noisy to navigate. The behavior forensics in this case, the specific targeting of the house, the deliberate camera removal, the preparation visible in the photographs, all of it points toward what profilers call an organized offender, someone who planned, who anticipated, and who understood the specific vulnerabilities of a specific target. That profile is not consistent with opportunistic crime. It is consistent with knowledge. And knowledge of this kind, in a residential setting, almost always has a traceable origin. Jennifer Coffundafer watched this case for 41 days before she said what she said. She did not say Nancy Guthrie had been found. She did not say an arrest was imminent. The night of January 31st was ordinary. Nancy had dinner at the home of her daughter Annie and Annie's husband, Tommaso Cioni. She said the search phase was over, and she said the case was red hot. Those are 2 different kinds of statements. One describes what is no longer happening. The other describes the temperature of what is. Somewhere in the evidence collected from that house in the Catalina foothills, in the DNA samples being processed at Arizona State University, in the footage gaps that a source described as odd, in the list of names the FBI requested from a neighbor about workers on a nearby construction site, in the questions asked about someone who moved away before January 31st, in the 41 minutes that no official account has yet explained, the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie exists. The investigation has it, or is close enough to it that a former federal agent who has spent her career reading these situations called it red hot. They played cards. It was the kind of evening that doesn't register as significant until it becomes the last one. What is not yet resolved is the public accounting. That accounting has not arrived. It may not arrive quickly. Federal investigations move on their own timeline, and that timeline is built around the strength of what can be proven, not the urgency of what is already suspected. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in the same corner of Tucson for more than half a century. She had heart medication on her kitchen counter that she never took that night. She had hearing aids still sitting in her house when police arrived. She was somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother, somebody who played cards with her family on a Friday evening and was gone before morning. If this case matters to you, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the next update. Because this investigation is still moving, and when something breaks, We will be here with the full picture. Around 9:48 that night, Tommaso drove Nancy home. And if you want to understand how we got from that garage door closing at 9:50 on January 31st to where we are now, the earlier coverage is linked for you. Watch it in order. The full timeline matters. The search phase is over. The question is what comes next. And then, 41 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in the Catalina foothills, a security camera recorded the garage door opening. 2 minutes later, the garage door closed. That was the last confirmed moment anyone outside that house saw Nancy Guthrie and knew she was safe. Inside the house, on the kitchen counter, her evening medication was sitting exactly where she had left it, untouched. Her hearing aids were still in the house when police arrived the next morning. Think about what that means for a woman who depended on both of those things. Whatever happened in that house, it happened fast enough, or violently enough, or without enough warning, that she did not take her medication before bed, and she did not remove her hearing aids. Those are not the circumstances of someone who decided, at 84, with a pacemaker and limited mobility, to go somewhere on her own. When the family couldn't reach her the next morning, when she didn't appear for a scheduled appointment, police responded to the house. What they found on the front porch was blood. Coffundafer went on national television and said 5 words that stopped a lot of people cold. The search phase is over. Forensic testing confirmed it belonged to Nancy Guthrie. She was gone, and based on everything that was present in that house and everything that wasn't, she had not left on her own terms. To understand what investigators were dealing with, you have to look at the hours between 9:50 that night and what was discovered the next morning. Because embedded in that window is a sequence of events that, when laid out in order, points in a very specific direction. At 1:47 in the morning, the Ring camera mounted at Nancy Guthrie's front door went offline. Not because of a power outage, because someone physically removed it from its mount. That is not a technical glitch. That is a deliberate act, executed in the early hours of February 1st, at a house where an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker was the only person home. 41 minutes later, at 2:28, Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her iPhone. 41 minutes. The camera comes down first. Then, almost to the minute, the device monitoring her heart goes dark. Not the investigation, the search. Those 2 words mean very different things to someone who spent a career inside the Bureau. Law enforcement has not publicly explained what happened in that window. No official account covers it. What is confirmed is the sequence, and the sequence does not suggest coincidence. The camera footage that does exist is significant. In one image, recovered from the front-facing camera before it was taken down, a figure appears near the home carrying a gun and a backpack. Former CIA and FBI analyst Tracy Walder reviewed the known details and put it plainly, this is not a house you walk past and decide to rob. The camera, the timing, the specific nature of the target. Someone planned this. A neighbor who spoke to investigators, identified publicly only as Laura, confirmed that the FBI had visited her home at least 3 times, asking for footage. She told investigators she believed there were at least 2 perpetrators involved. Then there is the detail of the flashlight. A search phase ends one of 2 ways. You found the person, or you know enough to stop looking. In the camera footage, investigators captured an image of a figure with a flashlight held in their mouth, a technique used to keep hands free in darkness. Experts from Arizona State University, speaking to journalist Brian Enton, described this as a potentially critical piece of evidence. If that flashlight was recovered, it could contain DNA. As of the time this video was produced, no confirmation of a DNA match from that item had been made public. What you are looking at, across every one of these details, is the work of someone who came prepared. Prepared for the camera. Prepared for the dark. Prepared for the specific layout of a specific house. Former CIA and FBI analyst Tracy Walder's assessment applies to every layer of what is documented here. This was not random, which means the question of who knew enough about Nancy Guthrie's house, her schedule. There was no announcement from Pima County, no press conference, no statement from Sheriff Chris Nanos, and her vulnerabilities to plan something like this is not a peripheral question. It is the investigation. 3 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, ransom notes began arriving. First at local news outlets in Tucson, then at national outlets, then at TMZ. The notes reference Bitcoin. They contain deadlines. Both deadlines passed. There was no follow-through, no additional contact, no proof of life. People who have spent careers investigating kidnapping for ransom will tell you that the anatomy of a genuine abduction for money follows a certain logic. The kidnapper needs the victim alive because the victim is the leverage. Deadlines are set to create urgency. But more than that, the communication goes to the people who can pay, which means the family. You do not send ransom demands to a local television station if you are trying to extract money from a family. You send them to the people who have the money. These notes went to newsrooms. Just a former federal agent, someone who had been described as following this case like it was her own, James Gagliano, a former supervisory FBI agent who spoke to CNN about the case, noted that the statistical rate of kidnapping for adults over 80 years old is, in his words, close to zero. He raised the possibility of what investigators call virtual kidnapping, a scenario in which ransom notes are generated, sometimes using AI, to create the appearance of an abduction that may not have occurred in the way the notes describe. Retired NYPD Sergeant Joe Giacalone was more direct on his true crime podcast. He said he never believed the ransom narrative from the beginning. Someone was arrested in connection with the disappearance for attempting to defraud the family. That arrest confirmed that at least one person saw an opportunity in this family's grief and tried to exploit it. Whether the ransom notes represent the same impulse or something more coordinated is a question investigators have not answered publicly. Here is what sits at the center of all of this. Every element of the ransom narrative behaves differently than a real kidnapping for ransom would behave. Telling the country that whatever law enforcement was doing now, it was no longer about finding Nancy Guthrie alive in a room somewhere. The destination of the notes, the broken deadlines, the silence that followed. Two former FBI agents and a former NYPD sergeant have all said, in different ways and in different venues, that they do not believe what happened to Nancy Guthrie fits the standard profile of a stranger abduction for money. So if the ransom notes didn't come from whoever took Nancy, where did they come from? And if the kidnapping narrative is wrong, what is the right one? What do you think? Were the ransom notes real, or were they designed to send investigators in the wrong direction? Let us know in the comments, because this detail is one of the most contested elements of the entire case, and your read on it matters. While the public was still absorbing the ransom note story, investigators were working a different set of problems entirely. Inside the house, FBI forensic teams collected DNA samples. What they found complicated things. The samples were mixed, meaning they contained genetic material from more than one person,